Metroidvania is the hardest game genre to review because of how vague its game design is. Even the name Metroidvania is just a combo of two associated games, Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night, but outside of the shared general structure of guided exploration and utility-gated progression, as Wikipedia puts it, the moment-to-moment gameplay between these two is significantly different. Super Metroid is a projectile-based game that emphasizes precision platforming, wall interactions, and completion speed via the in-game timer, whereas Symphony of the Night is an expansion on the arcade platformer that emphasizes melee combat and boss fights. So even with the conception of this style of game, we already have two fundamentally different strains. Should the game use movement tech and treat the enemies as speed bumps, as Super Metroid does? Or should the game force enemy interactions and make the survival the foundation of player skill, as Symphony of the Night initially does? And I say initially because there is a natural opposition of design where the less restricted the player's movement becomes, the less the player needs to interact with the enemies blocking his way, especially if the larger exploration-based structure insists on a lot of backtracking and naturally pushes the player to move through the rooms as quickly as possible. This is a problem that really stands out in Symphony of the Night, where it begins feeling like a more open-ended take on Castlevania, especially Rondo of Blood, but then transforms, fittingly enough, into a Super Metroid style of just avoiding enemies and speeding through the rooms once the player unlocks the double jump and bat transformation. Point being, as a genre, what is the fundamental goal of Metroidvania design? What does good Metroidvania gameplay look like? This is a question that seems to evade a clear answer, and the reason why is because I think the initial concept of the Metroidvania is a compromise to begin with, and I'm not saying this to be dismissive of the genre. I am a lifelong fan of Super Metroid. I just think it's important to have a clear understanding of what is happening. Look at the Wikipedia description again. To have guided exploration is a compromise in itself, but ironically, it is clearly an effective one. Most players, myself included, are not interested in wandering around looking for keys or hidden abilities that might be useful in the future. We want focus, we want pace, we want a clear purpose to our actions, so the guiding aspect makes sense. What is harder to answer is why have exploration in the first place, especially on repeated playthroughs where you already know the entire map and the novelty factor of just looking around has worn off. The cynical side of me wants to say that this low-intensity, novelty-based design is very commercially viable, and I do think that is an undeniable aspect of the origins of Metroidvania, where in an interview, the devs of Symphony of the Night explicitly state that the RPG exploration elements were added to increase the perceived value of the game, and on top of that, they lowered the difficulty to overturn the hard game image of Castlevania, so there is that. But to be charitable as well, I think an appeal of the open-ended structure of Metroidvania is the variety of gameplay mechanics that it allows. Basically, by forfeiting a lot of the focus of the game design, the devs are able to include a lot more variety in terms of gameplay mechanics and essentially allow the player to assemble their own experience from these mechanics. Metroidvania is a game design buffet, essentially. And it's funny how accurately this analogy tracks in terms of how it appeals to its fan base. There is no one defined experience that Metroidvania players share with each other because there is no one defined focus of the genre. Vanias do a little bit of everything, but not too much of anything. The games have enemies that you may or may not feel like fighting. They have progression systems that you may or may not decide to care about. They are difficult enough to feel like you need to pay attention, but not so much that you'll actually be stopped in your forward progression. They have boss fights that you can learn, but if you don't feel like it, you can also just tank through them via the RPG elements. There are trade-offs and risks, but no one element can be emphasized too much, because then it would override the rest of the open structure. Like I said in the beginning, this is why Metroidvanias are difficult to critique, because it's like critiquing a buffet. If I go to the buffet and want great Mexican food, I can point out that the burritos are terrible, but then another person could completely disregard this because they are only there to eat mac and cheese and Oreo ice cream, and what can be said about that? And so when discussing a post-Symphony Castlevania game, what I value is getting moment-to-moment meaning and overall quality of all of its elements together, where instead of just giving the buffet credit for having 200 different mediocre dishes, let's at least try to scale this down to 50 quality dishes that have some kind of coherent philosophy behind them. And this is where I think the DS games of the Castlevania Dominus Collection are excellent examples of refining the Metroidvania concept that should be taken a lot more seriously. And so to start, I think it's important to acknowledge that these games were developed for the handheld platform, because in a lot of ways I see handhelds as the last bastion for classic game design, because the environment that they created is very reminiscent of the arcade environment. Because first of all, they're much more likely to be based off of iterative design because of the low production costs and because of the stricter hardware limitations. This allowed developers to actually scale down their productions, which in modern game design is a huge problem, because if you make a game and the game is successful, like let's say Symphony of the Night, and you're making the sequel for current console hardware, then you need to scale up the sequel. And what happens with a lot of video game series, classic or otherwise, is they begin in a kind of small scale fashion, they grow over time, they start to become successful, they start to get that mainstream sort of sales, and then they need to keep growing and expanding, and one day they outgrow their original audience base and create a big old game that doesn't sell super well or doesn't return cost on investment, and that's kind of it. It's like, well, this is a dead end now, and no more of this series. And we've seen this happen with Castlevania on consoles, but luckily this series had the oasis of handheld design, where because of these hardware limitations, there's only so much money Konami could spend on art and on the size of the game. They were able to scale the games down to be more economical, and so even if they didn't sell amazingly well, they sold enough to justify the continuation of their design. And what's really cool about handhelds is they have usually much longer lifespans, or they used to. I guess these days consoles have really long lifespans too, but traditionally they had longer lifespans than their console counterparts. And so you could see real iterations of series over these classic handhelds because they couldn't continue to push the graphics much further. They couldn't continue to push the size of the games much further. The hardware literally prevented that. So they had to get a little bit more innovative with the core game design. They had to look at the game design they had in front of them and refine it and make it more replayable and interesting and more contained, like arcade games, because naturally what we see happening with a lot of Metroidvanias and these types of open-ended styles of games is, well, the natural direction is just make it bigger. Look at Grand Theft Auto. Literally every Grand Theft Auto game, Vice City, San Andreas, then Grand Theft Auto 5, it's just like, make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And now Grand Theft Auto is so huge that Grand Theft Auto 6, God knows how much time and money they've had to put into that and how giant that's going to be. But with these open-ended games, they just get bigger. That's always the idea. Look at Elden Ring. Everything just gets bigger. But because we had the handheld format for these Castlevania games, we actually got a refreshing break from this. And instead, we saw the games get more refined, at least by the end. And my favorite of this collection, and the game I'm going to focus on the most for this review, is Order of Ecclesia, because I think that game took a step back and really thought about what makes Castlevania strong. What elements of this Metroidvania design are specifically important to highlight in Castlevania style, and what elements maybe should be tapered back a little bit. And I know that the other games leading up to Ecclesia also made strides in this direction, Portrait of Ruin, but I think Ecclesia does it best, and so that is the one I'm going to be focusing on mostly in this review, but some of these things will also apply to the earlier DS games as well. But the first thing that I think Ecclesia got right that Symphony of the Night really struggles with is balancing the enemy design with the level structure, because like I said in the beginning of the review, there is a natural tension between having the focus of the game being
interacting with aggressive enemies, like you see in Classicvania, or having the focus of the game being traversing this big open-ended map, like we see in Super Metroid. One kind of needs to supersede the other, and what we end up seeing with Symphony of the Night is an interesting phenomenon that I don't think other people have pointed out before, which is when you get into the more secluded sections of Symphony of the Night, these areas of the game that you don't really go to very often, you just go to them one time, like in the outskirts of the castle. Those areas tend to be more populated with aggressive enemies or have more dense combat sections. But if you get into the center parts of the map and of the castle, the enemies are almost non-existent, and even if they are technically there, they are very passive. And what ends up happening is an interesting sort of dynamic where when you're backtracking through the central areas of the castle that have a lot of foot traffic, you notice the enemies are essentially non-existent. They're barely there, and even if they're there, they kind of just hang out and watch you go by. They're very easy to avoid, and when you get more leveled up later on, you kill them in one hit if you even bother killing them. They're a non-factor anymore. And then when you get into the more focused areas of the castle that you only go to a time or two, that's when there's actual enemy interaction and enemy fights. And so with the Castlevania series, I've noticed the trend that forward progression is the meat of the game and it is the interesting part of the game, and backtracking is lame and boring. And yes, this is my own taste, but apparently Konami, by the end, agreed, because Ecclesia took a look at the structure of Castlevania and I think did a great revamp on the open world structure, where essentially you are only moving forward in Ecclesia. You hardly ever go backwards. They made a real concerted effort in Ecclesia to keep you moving forward and making the backtracking and moving back through the maps as efficient as possible. And they achieved this in a number of ways. And the thing about this is, because the series has been so iterative, and I have been playing the series all week long and even longer than a week at this point, but there's still probably going to be things that happen across these games that don't exactly originate in Ecclesia. So if some of the earlier DS games start to do this sort of stuff, like Portrait of Ruin in a little bit, please excuse that, but you see it really clarified in Ecclesia, where now you have a central map system with little regions, and then you can exit these regions and select them in an overworld map, very much like Neo. And what this creates is a very fun dynamic where you can go into the map and move forward into unexplored territory constantly. But if you want to go back to an earlier region, you want to go back to a different region, you can just, with the snap of a finger, use that ticket item, go back to the main menu, and then go to that other region, maybe stop at a save point and heal in between. But you're instantly jumping into these more contained areas of the map that, when you combine them all together, are still plenty of space to run around and explore if you're into that sort of thing, but they also create a much stronger focus and clarity. And that is something that I really appreciate and I really like, because you're getting the best of both worlds, I think, here, where you're able to take those sort of branching paths and do all these different things that you want to do. But if you want to power through the game, which is my style of playing these kinds of games, and get to the meat and get to the heart of the content, you're not having nearly as much downtime. You're not having nearly as much repeated sections or just rote gameplay of, all right, let's go through here. We're going to jump left, right up this platform. We're going to go to this room. You know, there's all this sort of essentially gameplay load screens with a lot of Metroidvanias because of their backtracking systems. But in Ecclesia, the backtracking is eliminated as much as possible, and I really appreciate that. And I think it actually elevates the game in a lot more reasons than just convenience. Another thing that it allows is it allows for the enemy design to be much more aggressive, or they either thought of these two things simultaneously or whatever is happening, but the enemies of Ecclesia are a lot more active and aggressive, and the stages of Ecclesia are a lot more classically composed than you see in something like Symphony of the Night, where you do actually have to route through some of these sections. It feels like real classic level design. like in the prison section where you have the searchlights and you have the guys running around and you have to time and move through these sections to get through it. And this is a type of section that wouldn't really work super well, or it'd be pretty obnoxious in a game with a lot of backtracking, because it is making you slow down and deal with it, especially on level 1 hard mode, which is the definitive version of the game. In my opinion, you do need to engage with the enemies and think about the enemies a lot more than you need to in other Metroidvanias. And another awesome aspect of this segmented design is it allows for certain sections of the game to be significantly more intense than they would be able to be if it had to be interconnected with other sections of the game. My favorite example of this is the forest when you're playing level 1 hard mode. That forest is just a flat field. I know Metroidvania players aren't probably thrilled with this since there's no little coves to get into and that type of thing. But what's great about this section when it's ramped up in the difficulty, and the fact that it can be segmented away, that you don't have to return to it if you don't want to, is how much more intense the enemy design of this section becomes. It is wild how ruthless this section is, and I don't think there's another section quite like this anywhere else in Castlevania, where you've got these randomly spawning skeletons that continually spawn, by the way, so you can't do the trick of killing them and moving back, killing them and moving back. They'll just keep coming. Same with the bats. And then you've got these really aggressive flying squid enemies homing in on you, chasing after you. So during all of this chaos, you need to take these key enemies out while avoiding and dodging the randomly spawning skeletons. It's just a great example of active enemy design that I think a lot more Metroidvanias could really benefit from, especially when paired with level 1 mode, but we'll talk about level 1 mode a little bit later. But in terms of this segmented style of design, I am a huge fan of it generally, and I think it actually does tie back to the handheld premise of the game, because with handheld gameplay sessions, usually the behavior is you don't sit down and marathon while you're playing on a handheld, typically. Sometimes if you're on a bus or something that happens, but for the most part, handhelds are meant to be pick up and play and immersive right then and there. There's a real value of the player's gameplay time. And so not only do I think this is great design in terms of making a handheld Castlevania, I think this is great design in making any Castlevania and making games generally. And I think that's what leads these games to being a lot more active than their console counterparts. And speaking of being active, another part of this game's design that I very much appreciate, that once you experience it, it's really hard to go back. I went back and played Symphony of the Night after playing Ecclesia and a little bit of Portrait of Ruin, which is the active map screen. And what's funny is that we know exactly where this active map screen comes from. It comes from the fact that the DS has this second screen. And so the developer needs to figure out, all right, what are we going to put on this second screen that's going to display constantly, which is the map. Having this active map screen as you're playing and you're seeing that and you're not having to pause the game and go to the map and, oh, where am I? Having it just be there active as you're playing is something that now I think should be a standard across all Metroidvanias. As I said in my previous review of Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, I like games making these types of systems as active as possible. The less we stop, the less we pause, the better. And so having this active map on screen is a great move forward, even if it does just kind of come from a hardware byproduct of there being two screens. Now, there's no reason, even with a 16:9 game, you can't have like a optional active on screen map that's like transparent in the corner. There's no reason you can't do that. And it's something, again, that I think should be taken a lot more seriously rather than just a curiosity of these DS games. And another part about these games being active that I really like is the Glyph sleeve system. This isn't fully active like Shadow of the Ninja, where you can't pause the game to change the inventory, but I like the shortcut we have here where In Symphony of the Night and most Metroidvanias, if you want to change your weapons for the upcoming section or the boss, you pause, you go into the inventory, you equip, play. And that functions, but it isn't that active. Whereas with the Glyph sleeve system, the way it works is you go in and you preload your sleeve with different weapon layouts. And then as you're playing, you can just actively switch to these weapon layouts. I think it would be even cooler, though probably controversial, if they didn't allow you to pause while playing, where if you wanted to change your Glyph sleeves, you'd need to pause Dark Souls style, but the game would still be running. I would like that, but I know that would be a bit much for Metroidvania players, but I do like what it's doing here with at least allowing you to not pause if you don't want to. And that ties in really well with the more developed weapon system of the game, because the way it works in Ecclesia is different enemy types are weak to different styles of weapons, sort of like Fire Emblem, where fleshy enemies are weak to pointed, sharp weapons like swords and daggers, and then armored or bone enemies are weak to blunt slamming weapons like hammers. And I think a system like this kind of exists in Symphony of the Night as well, but because the difficulty isn't high enough to make it matter, it doesn't really matter anyway. Difficulty clarifies design. If the game isn't hard enough to test you actually using the system, does the system matter? Or in Ecclesia, especially on level 1 hard mode, no, it really matters. Using the correct weapon type is critical, and an interesting acknowledgement of this that ties in with the Glyph sleeve is that on normal mode, where it doesn't really matter as much, you don't get the Glyph sleeve until later in the game, but in hard mode, where matching up the weapon types to the enemy types matters right away, you actually get the Glyph sleeve right at the start of the game, so you're able to use it in the first levels. And the Glyph sleeve and the enemy weapon weakness type blend together very well. I think this is a really cool way to make the gameplay more active, and you can really see this in that forest stage where you get the flying squids and then the boned skeletons, and you have to switch between using sword and using hammer. And what's even more fun about the weapon system of Ecclesia is that you're not just paying attention to the weapon type, you're also paying attention to the natural properties of the weapon in terms of the startup and recovery frames and the hitboxes. So for example, in terms of straight up damage and hitboxes, using the lance, I think it is the strongest in terms of pure damage output, especially if you auto fire the attack buttons. But the problem with the lances is that they're just directly in front of you hitbox wise, and so with the squids that approach you vertically, the sword is the better option to use because of the arcing hitbox. And you'll see this in a lot of situations throughout the game, where sometimes using those concentrated hitboxes of the lances are better, like dealing with bats, then at other times using the arcing hitbox of the sword is better to deal with things above you or kind of further away from you. So I like that the game doesn't just mix and match with using weapon type on enemy type, but then also adds the nuances of different weapon properties of the same type that have hitbox differences and recovery differences and stamina differences. So there's a lot more depth to it than just matching the weapon to the enemy. It's a very fun gameplay dynamic where once you get into it and then you go back to older Castlevania games with inventory systems, those inventories feel underdeveloped in comparison to this more active style of inventory. Another aspect of Ecclesia that feels more fully developed are the boss fights. First of all, I love the no damage metal option of the fights. I felt instantly compelled to try to get that in every single boss fight, especially because the port has save states, so you could save at the beginning of the boss and practice and all that great stuff. But getting the medals really helps offset a problem with Metroidvania boss design, where because there are these RPG mechanics or item mechanics and leveling up type of systems in Metroidvanias, what can happen is you can either get so powerful that you one-shot the bosses, which still exists, but on top of that, there's the other option of you can get so tanked up that you can just sit there and take damage and beat the bosses that way. And so at least having the no damage metal helps offset the tanking aspect. And then with the level 1 mode, that offsets the one-shotting via RPG mechanic. For the most part, it isn't perfectly executed, but it's still a lot better done than most Metroidvanias, especially because going back and playing Symphony, I was surprised how basic the boss fights of the game were, where within about a minute of practice, I found a degenerate loop in the enemy AI, whereas in Ecclesia, I was able to find a boss loop or two, but that did end up taking more time and more study, and a lot of the bosses just fundamentally held together and were really fun and engaging. Probably the most engaging and interesting boss fight of Ecclesia is the Grim Reaper in Dracula's castle. That thing I sat and fought against for over an hour, not just because I was struggling to beat it, but because I was really fascinated to try to see, can I find something to break this guy? And I couldn't. It was just, you had to beat him fundamentally, and it was really fun. And the overall boss design of Ecclesia is just miles ahead of Symphony of the Night. And I keep bringing up Symphony of the Night, not because I dislike the game, but because when you look at conversations around Metroidvanias and Castlevania, these poor DS handheld games get what I call the shmup treatment, which is, on paper, if you look at the reviews when they came out and you looked at the discussion when they came out, they tend to get, nice reviews, nice scores. Everyone's like, oh, what a cute game, isn't it great? But they're not taken seriously. And that is the problem. Shmups have the same problem. And when you look at greatest games of all time, greatest Metroidvanias of all time, greatest Castlevanias of all time, Ecclesia and its brethren are always relegated to the lower echelons of the list, and Symphony of the Night is just always definitively
the best.
Because it's got the amazing graphics and the reputation and the great soundtrack. It's got the riz, it's got the style, there's no denying that. But in terms of the core game design, I think the progression from Symphony of the Night needs to be more widely recognized, because I think this stuff would translate over to a lot of Metroidvanias coming out now in a really good way. And the big marquee hallmark feature, the big shining light of Ecclesia, and I think it's also in Portrait of Ruin, but again, I think Ecclesia develops it even further, is the level 1 hard mode, which, coming from the dev team themselves, is all about giving back to veteran players. It is a funny full circle moment where Classicvania had the reputation of being too difficult, so they eased it down to change the public reputation with Symphony of the Night. And then as the series has gone on, they've returned back. It's a return to form of giving back to the hardcore players, bringing back the difficulty. And the hard mode of Ecclesia is really challenging and really worthwhile, especially when paired with the level 1 mode. And I think that extra distinction of level 1 is very important, because a huge problem with pretty much all Metroidvanias that you play is, as the game progresses, it tends to become boring, because with all of your upgrades, you become a god and nothing can stand before you. And even if the game does a pretty good job of scaling along with the player's progression and gives you a cool fight at the end and everything, it still doesn't really work super well in terms of replayability. How do you address this problem? Well, one way to address this problem that I'm a big fan of is the level 1 approach, where not only do you play at a higher difficulty, but you also prevent the RPG leveling system. So the game's RPG power creep is at least tampered down somewhat. Is it perfectly executed? No, the game ends up having really funny, strange difficulty spikes. Like, the initial forest stage in level 1 hard mode is insanely difficult, and then some of the stages afterward aren't nearly as bad, but it's a huge step forward, and I think it's a concept that brings forward a lot of depth and replayability and actually tests the gameplay mechanics. I could see a situation where if you just play through Ecclesia on normal mode, you may never actually use the glyph sleeves, but as soon as you're on level 1 hard mode, you're gonna have to learn that stuff. And what's great about Ecclesia is that it's not just upping enemy damage and enemy health like a lot of games would probably do. It brings a lot more to the mode. It actually changes the way the levels play It brings in enemy spawns. It changes the enemy aggression, the enemy behavior. They get a lot more active. You go into the skull cave, the firing rates of the skull heads becomes way more dangerous, and you actually have to change some of the strategies, because when I played the skull cave on normal mode, I could just go in there with a hammer, and then you go into level 1 hard mode and you're getting blasted by the skulls. You have to sit down and think and like, how do I deal with this situation? The hammer has too much recovery. And the new strategy I was informed of that Boghog actually passed on to me is if you use the zombie spawn, the zombie can tank the enemy shots for you. And so you can use it as a shield to negate their fireballs. And so the variety is now actually being tested. I talked about earlier in the review about how Metroidvania, a strength of it is having variety, having different player mechanics you can play with. A problem with that's often circumvented in lesser Metroidvanias, I guess, is that because the balance isn't really that intense and because the difficulty isn't there, the variety is more just of what you feel like doing rather than being fundamentally important to understand. Because if your sword kills everything, what is the variety? It's just some kind of aesthetic difference in a lot of cases. But in the case of Ecclesia, in the level 1 hard mode, all of a sudden the variety of the attacks and weapon properties start to matter. It starts to make sense why you'd have different attacks that do different things. And like I said, it isn't perfectly balanced. It isn't exactly 100%, but it's definitely on the right track. If you're going to give me the buffet of gameplay mechanics, make me use them. Make them meaningful. If it exists, give it a purpose, and don't just let me override everything with one god move that nullifies the rest of the game. Ecclesia probably has some of this in it. You know, some of the magic spells are kind of OP, but like I said, it's on the right track. It has the right concept. And I could go on about this game, but let's wrap up with one other thing that I really love about this release. We cannot have a review of a collection without talking about the quality of the port, especially because I am a huge fan of the M2 ports. They are the masters at work, because the port tools of this Metroidvania collection also really helps establish it as a must-buy title, in my opinion, because not only are you getting these great games and you're finally getting them off of the DS. As cool as the DS is, it's still cooler to be able to play it on your PC or on your console. And I had no idea until playing this collection how much Metroidvanias benefit from save states, not only in terms of practice tools like practicing the bosses for the no metal, learning their dynamics and AI without having to go back to reset rooms and just making that more efficient, but also in terms of getting through the map, because turns out when you're playing without save states, a common thing you end up doing, though the segmented structure doesn't make this as prevalent in Ecclesia, is still periodically just returning to the save room, not because you necessarily need to, but because you just playing the risk and reward of, I don't know what's around this corner, and I don't want to risk all of this forward progression I've made, not because it's hard to get back here, not because it's difficult, but because it's tedious. And so to prevent the tedium, what I'll do is run to the save room real quick and then come back. This is a very common behavior. But with save states, you just get to that corner, like, let me pop in a save state, go around the corner, what's over there? It's not really changing the difficulty of the game. It's just saving on the tedium of going back and forth to save points a lot and just making it more efficient to play. And really what this game needs, and kind of the final christening thing that I think would make this style of Castlevania really cool, is if it had some kind of condensed arcade mode that builds off the level 1 mode. So you have level 1 mode, but then you have a more laid out sequenced Classicvania style. I mean, you could have this as a mode. Why not? You just chop up sections of the overworld and then lay them together as one mode, and you just go through the whole thing, get some kind of scoring involved or get some kind of time involved. There's no reason, in my opinion, why these Metroidvania style games can't also include classic style modes in them to bridge that gap and give you best of both worlds. If you're making the Metroidvania stuff for the commercial appeal, for the accessibility, I get it. I'm not a huge fan of that, but I get it. But then why not also take the opportunity to use segments of the game, to use the enemies you've made, to use the bosses you've made, and then fashion them into linear, traditional style of mode? I just would love to see that. And I think it's like the final missing piece. And I do wonder if the Castlevania series progressed and continued on past Ecclesia, if maybe they would start doing something like that. You can feel how close Ecclesia is to going there. It's right on the doorstep. And the level 1 hard mode is a great move in that direction. But anyway, on top of the 3 DS games, M2 have also included the arcade title Haunted Castle, which I think is really fun and quite challenging. And then as another additional bonus, apparently they've made a little original game called Haunted Castle Revisited, which is their own original Classicvania that I find fun and refreshing. It's bonus content, so I'm not going to get too critical of it, but since it is so fun to play and so awesome, and it's nice to return to the whip style and the more constrained controls and that classic limited arcade platformer DNA that I'm such a huge fan of, I do wish it was a little bit more difficult. I was a little bit shocked at how easily I powered through it. It does have a hard mode, but I suspect that on top of that, it would have been great if it had an extreme mode or really pushed the difficulty, but it is still a really fun, worthwhile inclusion, and it is cute that it has little stage select options. I love how much more effort M2 put even into their bonus content than most other ports bother with their overall package. So in conclusion, the Dominus Collection rules, especially Order of Ecclesia, and even though the games aren't perfect in the game balance sense, I think Metroidvanias really struggle just as a concept with balance because of the kind of compromised initial process. But that being said, I'm really pleasantly surprised with how much I ended up enjoying this style of Metroidvania that these later Castlevania games started to develop, and I think they're on a really great track. It is sad that it just ends with Order of Ecclesia. We were starting to get cooking here. Things were starting to really heat up. This was going to be a great, bright future, and then boom, no more handheld, no more Order of Ecclesia. It is a bummer, but in the end, I do really recommend this collection, and it's kind of absurd how much content it has, quality content. I'm not about sheer volume and that sort of thing, but these 3 games with this quality of porting, plus the additional bonus Classicvanias of Haunted Castle and Haunted Castle Revisited, that's a release that's kind of a slam dunk that I can't imagine any fan of the series not getting into and enjoying. And I also think that these games being available in this format is great, because going back and emulating them or playing on them on the handheld, that's great, but I think having them accessible in this form will hopefully allow them to be taken a lot more seriously. Who knows, maybe even if we don't see future Castlevanias, these ideas, these concepts can hopefully spread out into more Metroidvanias coming out now and making the genre overall a lot cooler than it currently is. So if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out last week's review of Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, because I think these 2 games are interesting counterpoints to one another, where Shadow Reborn is taking that classic arcade platformer style and adding in a little bit more of that modern variety active item system into it. And then we get the reverse here of the Dominus Collection and Order of Ecclesia, where it's taking the Metroidvania style and adding in more of that classic enemy-focused, boss-focused, segmented level design style into the Metroidvania formula. So you can see them as sort of twins, mirror images of one another in some ways, which I think is really cool, and I enjoy both of them. And if you can, I'd really appreciate support on Patreon. I am officially a full-time YouTuber as of this month, where my only income comes from this work, and so that's really freeing and a dream come true, but also scary a little bit. So really appreciate some additional support on Patreon if you're so inclined. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100 Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Ali Hashmi, Dingo, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Alai, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Beto Dames, Blade Symphony, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chad Memphis, Chase Palumbo, Shay Phillip, Chronic Burnout 3, Christopher R, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Cooksan 666, Cook Some Soup, Corio, Crump 12, Des Audio, DRK, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Andrus, David Crespo, Delta 6, Demian Smirnov, The Solus, DJ 420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Edvard, Elbin Senisev, Delanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Evie Zerker, Falcus, F Deluxe, Fenech, Friskin, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Retro Schmupper, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hack, Hans Kowalski, Hausu, Hero Death, Hiki Hime, Hunharthy, Hud, Humongous, J-Dab, Jake Ryan, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JB RPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Gameboy Guru, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Contain, Praise the Boys, Ludwa, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Mechororca, Minong, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, Mewjam, Michael Del Polito, Malcolm McCord, Milady, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Morag, Monroe, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Perro, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Porol, Pedro Usilis, Phil Oz, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Raul, Rapido, RC, Real Scheme, Rent Halt's Time, Retrojet, Retro Schmupper, Ricky, Riff Mason, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Salmon Connections, San Nevo, Scanline City, Segfault, Shantak, Jazzy, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Sirapong, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Stepalable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tim French, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Sugumo, 2YU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Unicorn Roots, Ursula, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Rena, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zeno, and Zenryoku.